When suffering reveals order, Al-Ghazali's hidden law. You begin with an assumption that feels stable. You believe that certainty is the foundation of understanding. You trust that if you gather enough ideas, compare them carefully, and hold them firmly, truth will naturally follow. Yet when you pause and examine this belief, you notice it has never been verified. It has simply been inherited, repeated, and taken for granted. Al-Ghazali confronted this assumption early in his inquiry. He realized that confidence in knowledge is often a product of habit rather than insight. When you look closely at your own thinking, you see how easily the mind confuses familiarity with truth. What you call certainty may be no more than comfort wrapped in coherence. You begin to wonder, if certainty feels natural, why does it collapse when questioned? Al-Ghazali lived in a world shaped by intense intellectual exchange. Baghdad was a center of scholarship where philosophers defended rational proofs, theologians articulated doctrine, and mystics emphasized inner experience. Each group believed its method led to truth. Yet few examined the reliability of the mind itself. From within this world, Al-Ghazali recognized a shared oversight. All these disciplines assumed certainty was possible without verifying the instrument of certainty. You begin to ask, how can knowledge be trusted if the knower remains unexamined? Al-Ghazali's crisis emerged when he recognized that the mind often affirms what it wants to be true. Logical arguments appeared solid until he realized that logic depends on assumptions the mind rarely inspects. Sensory experience seemed trustworthy until he noticed how easily the senses can mislead. Even introspection became uncertain, for thought can disguise its own inconsistencies. You recognize a similar pattern in your own reasoning. What you accept as obvious stands untested. What you resist feels threatening because it disrupts established patterns. Suffering then becomes the moment when familiar assumptions fail to explain what you encounter. You begin to ask, if every foundation can be doubted, what remains to support certainty? You have been taught to see suffering as a random interruption, something that simply happens to you. But when you examine it more closely, suffering reveals itself as a signal pointing to something unexamined within your understanding. Pain draws attention to areas you ignore when life unfolds smoothly. It interrupts automatic living and forces you into awareness. Al-Ghazali observed that suffering is not merely emotional distress, it is intellectual disruption. When a belief fails to align with experience, the mind experiences tension. That tension is what you call suffering. The discomfort exposes the fragility of assumptions you never scrutinized. It shows where your interpretation of reality diverges from reality itself. Instead of questioning the experience, you often question its fairness. Yet fairness is secondary to clarity. Suffering highlights the gap between perception and truth. In this view, pain is not an accident but a structural feature of consciousness. It corrects distortions and reveals limits. It is not chaos but information. You begin to wonder, if suffering alerts you to misunderstanding, what else has it tried to show you that you refuse to see? As you examine your experiences, you notice that suffering rarely arises from events alone. It emerges from the interpretations you attach to them. A situation becomes intolerable not simply because it is difficult but because it violates expectations you assumed were universal. You suffer from the difference between how things are and how you insist they should be. Al-Ghazali argued that inner experience has a structure shaped by attachment, preference, and belief. These elements of consciousness remain hidden until they are challenged. When an expectation is unmet or when a belief is contradicted, suffering surfaces. It functions as a mirror showing the architecture of your inner life. You begin to notice patterns. You suffer most intensely when something threatens an identity you have constructed. You suffer when outcomes defy plans you believed you controlled. You suffer when meaning collapses around a narrative you thought stable. These insights do not remove pain, but they clarify its source. Suffering becomes a rational indicator. It reveals where thought clings to assumptions incompatible with reality. If pain exposes the hidden structure of your mind, then the presence of suffering becomes a kind of knowledge. But then you must ask, if suffering reveals your assumptions, who is the one observing the revelation? You often act as though control is a natural extension of understanding. If you think clearly, plan carefully, and anticipate obstacles, you feel you should be able to shape events according to your intentions. But suffering exposes the limits of this belief. It shows that control is not a property of the mind but an interpretation the mind imposes. Al-Ghazali discovered that the collapse of perceived control marks a turning point in self-understanding. It is not a failure but a revelation. When effort meets resistance, you see that outcomes are influenced by countless factors beyond your grasp. What felt like mastery was often coincidence, habit, or temporary alignment, not proof of control. You begin to recognize how the desire for control amplifies suffering. When reality diverges from your expectations, the mind interprets this divergence as loss or injustice. But the only loss is the collapse of an illusion. This collapse is uncomfortable because it removes a familiar sense of agency. Yet it opens the possibility of a more honest relationship with reality, one that acknowledges influence without assuming dominance. When the illusion falls away, what remains is clarity. Still, a question persists. If control disappears only under pressure, was it ever more than a comforting idea? As suffering dismantles illusions, your priorities begin to shift. What once appeared essential loses urgency, while what you previously ignored gains significance. The self begins to reorder itself, not through sudden transformation but through gradual recognition. Al-Ghazali experienced this reordering after his crisis. When certainty collapsed, he saw that much of what he valued was tied to reputation, achievement, or intellectual status. These outward markers provided identity but not understanding. In their absence, he turned toward what remained stable, the movement of awareness itself. You may notice something similar. When suffering strips away superficial structures, the mind becomes more sincere. Distractions fall away and attention turns inward. You begin to examine motivations, attachments, and thought patterns with greater honesty. The self becomes less concerned with approval and more concerned with truth. This reordering does not eliminate suffering, but it changes its meaning. Pain becomes a clarifier rather than an adversary. And yet another question arises. Why does clarity appear only when everything you relied on begins to fall away? You may have believed that suffering is arbitrary, a disorder in the fabric of life. But as you reflect more deeply, you begin to see a pattern. Pain appears precisely when perception strays from reality. When expectations exceed possibility, when attachments distort judgment, or when assumptions contradict facts, suffering emerges. Al-Ghazali recognized this as a functional law of inner experience. Suffering is not random, it is the mind's way of signaling misalignment. It exposes where thought diverges from truth. It dismantles illusions that would otherwise remain hidden. It calls attention to aspects of life you refuse to examine. This is the hidden law beneath pain. Suffering reveals the structure of your understanding by showing you where it fails. When you resist this process, the pain intensifies. When you examine it, the pain becomes information. You begin to understand that suffering does not oppose order, it reveals order. It clarifies the boundaries of what is real by exposing the limits of interpretation. It brings precision to the mind by confronting it with the consequences of distortion. In this light, pain is not an interruption in the logic of existence. It is part of that logic. Yet a final question demands attention. If suffering corrects your perception, why does the mind resist the very process that clarifies it? As your understanding deepens, suffering begins to shift from being a source of conflict to being a source of insight. Instead of resisting pain, you start to examine it. You trace it back to the assumption or expectation that produced it. You begin to see that suffering is not created by external events but by the meaning your mind imposes on them. Al-Ghazali's transformation unfolded through a similar realization. Once he stopped attempting to control his intellectual crisis and instead studied it, the crisis revealed coherence. What appeared to be the collapse of certainty was actually the exposure of false certainty. What seemed like chaos was the unveiling of a deeper order. You notice that suffering, when examined, opens into understanding. It shows where you cling to narratives that no longer represent reality. It reveals how much of your identity is built on unstable foundations. It exposes the contradictions within your thinking, not to punish you but to clarify you. This shift marks the transition from insight to realization. Pain no longer appears as an obstacle but as a teacher. It does not create disorder, it reveals the disorder already present. Still, the mind resists. And so a question remains. If suffering offers an opening into clarity, why does the mind insist on closing it? When suffering is examined rather than resisted, something subtle occurs. The tension between pain and meaning dissolves. You begin to see that suffering has revealed the limits of your assumptions, the fragility of your expectations, and the structure of your attachments. What remains is not despair but clarity. Al-Ghazali rested here. He understood that truth is not gained through control, certainty, or argument. It appears when distortion ends. When the self stops insisting on its interpretations, reality becomes self-evident. In this stillness, thought no longer claims ownership of truth. It simply recognizes it. And you are left with a final quiet question. If suffering reveals order, what remains when there is nothing left to correct?